less democratic or maybe have more, I completely lost my words, less democratic or are known for infringing on human rights more prevalently. However, we really need to rethink about whether we want to constrict what is currently a very decentralized system. And that decentralized system adds resiliency and robustness particularly at that layer. So is this something that we want to do? Have we thought through the implications that this will have in terms of combating harmful material that's online? I know this is a topic that the Internet Watch Foundation is extremely engaged and interested in, because it will take away some of the local jurisdiction that we have through our own national or regional policies and procedures, and place that with a tech company that's in the US. So what are our expectations of stakeholders now?
Good morning. Everyone looks a little tired, so I hope you all had coffee. I know it's Thursday and I know Brexit is dragging on, so I hope we can wake up and maybe have some thoughts about the discussion I'm going to have. So my name is Dominique Lazansky. Most of you know me. I work for myself. I'm an independent consultant focusing on cybersecurity policy and standards, primarily in the mobile industry. I'm just going to mention 3 different global governance processes, and it looks like these will be touched upon going forward throughout the day, so hopefully I can set the scene a little bit. And many of you here are involved in many other processes as well, so I'm really only going to touch on a couple because we don't have a lot of time. So the first one I think is sort of what I call the crisis for internet governance, or crisis of internet governance, and that's governing the internet in either a multi-stakeholder or a multilateral way. Clearly this has always been a tension, but I think we're seeing it more and more as the global internet governance always been a tension, but I think we're seeing it more and more as the global internet governance forum. It remains in Europe and is not attracting as many international people as it should be. And the numbers tend to be declining a little bit, versus like the World Internet Conference that is just finishing up in China this week, where it's sort of China hitting there more than in the Internet Governance Forum, in the Global Internet Governance Forum. So really you have a tension between multi-stakeholder and multilateral. But there was a high-level panel that the Secretary General convened that many of you might have heard from the UN, the Secretary General from the UN. And they looked at the future of what internet governance would be, and one of the options would be the IGF Plus model, which was bringing the IGF, the Global Internet Governance Forum, into the UN more closely to have more close governance processes and potential output, which has always been an ongoing tension since the IGF started as well. So we're sort of set in potential output, which has always been an ongoing tension since the IGF started as well. So we're sort of set in that scene right now where I think things could go many different ways, with other forums coming for internet governance and other areas and global regions having their own approach. The second one is cybersecurity, which I'm only going to touch upon briefly because you will be speaking about it later, which is the global group of experts and the open-ended working group in the UN. Issues about participation from different stakeholders. The GGE is very defined in terms of the number of countries that's allowed to participate, with the open-ended working group. And again, you're going to talk more about it later today. Had a lot of challenges with getting stakeholders involved. And again, that brings us to cybersecurity ongoing discussion, which is norms versus formalized treaties. So I'm grossly stating this, that basically the West and the countries that align with a more free or open net believe in norms, sort of best practices as well as capacity building, and placing responsibility on different stakeholders, as we heard with different companies, versus a treaty or a more formalized agreement. And I was just talking about Russia and China signed a formal agreement this week at the WIC in China on combating illegal content, which could be seen as a step towards a treaty. Finally, on standards, Stacie briefly talked about the DNS for HTTPS, but more globally, we're seeing quite a lot of standards forum shopping, competition and standards, and interoperability. Again, behavior, like the idea tends to be more Western focused in terms of protocols for the internet, whereas you're seeing other countries take advantage of other forms like the ITU, which is multilateral. And there's a lot of interesting duplication going on, and this is leading to quite a big discussion about future networks, future internet networks, but also what may be potentially termed 6G, and how that will be extremely different in different parts of the world after 5G is released. So just to conclude, one of the things that I come back to quite a lot is, there's so many processes, so many things going on that in a lot of ways I think the norms multi-stakeholder setting is really coming up against challenges because there's competition within processes in that area. Whereas the multilateral, there tends to be, it's quite coherent because there are very few areas where multilateral countries that tend to not be rights respecting and as much freedom online loving are able to be more coherent in those areas. So even though we've seen this for a long time, I think we're reaching a point where we're seeing an inflection point in these three areas through the different meetings and standards that are going on. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dominique. And can I just say it's wonderful to be able to share this space with three other women. Thank you for having me. My name is Sheetal Kumar, and I am a program lead at Global Partners Digital, which is an organization based in London, but we work globally, as our name indicates. And we're a human rights organization that operates at the intersection of digital policy and human rights. And as Stacie said, there's no shortage of things that we could securitization of some of the narrative around how to deal with some of the challenges the internet has brought about. This means that we're seeing cybercrime legislation, for example, or cybersecurity regulation being developed, which is not about protecting individuals or networks or devices, but actually criminalizing speech and creating, in some cases, standalone legislation which securitizes non-security issues. So, for example, as I said, criminalizes speech or extends surveillance powers. These are very, serious issues because what they do is they create a whole new regime of the application of criminal law online, very different from that offline, and that restricts speech, and that could have very grave consequences. Indeed, it's already having for societies around the world. So that's one trend, I think, that is happening. And we're seeing this legislation, like I said, many different countries. Some examples are Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, Pakistan, Morocco, Jordan, Nigeria, Tunisia, Uganda, where people are being arrested, human rights defenders, journalists, under cybercrime legislation or cybersecurity legislation, simply for contesting what political leaders might be saying. And this is something that the Special Rapporteur on countering violent extremism recently brought up in her most recent report, where she said, measures countering violent extremism online may touch upon multiple human rights, including the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy, the right to effective remedy, due process, and fair trial. Individuals using the internet to disseminate views considered blasphemous increasingly face capricious arrest and prosecution. The securitization of online activity provides a wide margin of operation for national authorities against civil society without proper scrutiny. So this is of increasing concern to civil society organizations, and I think should be to all of us. It's something that the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders has also brought up, that there's a closing of civic space, and I think that That's something that's happening beyond the internet or digital policy space, but it's certainly something we need to push back against in the ICT policy space because of the very nature of the internet as well. We've heard, how important it is to maintain the multi-stakeholder approach. So that's happening at the national level with cybercrime and cybersecurity legislation that's overly broad, that securitizes non-security issues. At the global level, Dominique, you mentioned the GGE and OEWG. Those are really important areas or spaces for discussion as well. And interesting, I think, for all of us, because although they might seem quite abstract and it's the first committee, so it's quite closed off, it's very important, I think, to follow these discussions, because what we're talking about there is how states should and shouldn't behave in cyberspace. And what we're seeing is an increasing trend for states to develop offensive cyber capabilities for military use, and unclear ideas about how those should be used in cyberspace. And that conversation is developing in the first committee, as you said, but there's an uneven sort of amount of capabilities of states to engage in these discussions, with certain ones leading the discussion and others not able to partake because of the dominance, I think, of a few states in driving that. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail afterwards in the question and answer section of our session. The other thing I think we need to bring up is that the narrative around about security and the national security kind of approach to it, we've also seen impact the debate around encryption. Now, we've heard how we're going to be living in a world where there's going to be more of the internet in more places, greater digitization. We're going to need to have more secure devices and secure communications. And the discussion around encryption needs to reflect that. And unfortunately, I think it has continued to be dominated by only a few voices. And I think, just as I would say as a general point, these discussions need to be more inclusive of a wide range of constituencies. So that's another area of concern. But on the flip side, I think what's also happening is we're seeing a tendency to adopt, in some countries around the world, in fact, I think more broadly, certain technologies without the adequate frameworks in place and safeguards. So one example is in some countries, as part of a development agenda, there has been a rush to implement biometric databases, for example, to distribute public services. But in Kenya and in India, as two examples, this has happened without the development of data protection frameworks. So these databases are being created and used without any safeguards for the protection of personal data. And that has already caused many issues, which I'm happy to go into. But that's something I think that needs to be considered, that there needs to be the right frameworks in place before we rush to adopt certain technologies. We're seeing that here in London already with the adoption of facial recognition technology, for example. And there has been pushback against that, as there has been in Canada, in cities like Toronto, where Google Sidewalk Labs as a project has been touted as, a way to develop smart cities and regenerate the urban space. But actually, and there's been a lot of coverage of this recently, and a lot of backlash from civil society in Canada and public authorities as well, those proposals rarely mention the citizen. They're actually just about digitizing. But tech for tech's sake is not good tech. So we're seeing some pushback against that. But as I mentioned, in some areas of the world, the civil society, the ability of civil society to push back or to understand these issues is limited. So although it might be the case in the UK or Canada, that there's a more sophisticated understanding of the implications of the adoption of certain technologies without the adequate frameworks in place, in other countries, that's not the case. And civil society is not able to push back or to inform or to be part of these discussions in the way that they should be. So, I think on that I will end. But I did want to just quote from a Forbes piece on the smart cities discussion that's happening in Canada, if you will allow me. So, in this Forbes piece, a journalist whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid, said, on smart cities, in a world of increasing division and inequality, the urban vision we need is one that is less technocentric and more anthropocentric. The urban utopia, if even possible, wouldn't be created by integrating the physical and the digital. It will be created by using both to support the people, the citizens, neighbours, the humans that make cities amazing places to work and live. And a celebrated urban theorist, Jane Jacobs, wrote in 1958, there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. And I think in that quote, we can substitute society for city and technology for buildings. So it reads, there is no logic that can be superimposed on society. People make it, and it is to them, not technology, that we must fit our plans. So I think that that's sort of where I want to end, and happy to pick some of those points up.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Maeve Walsh. I'm an independent policy consultant and an associate with Carnegie UK Trust, and I'm delighted to be here today on this great panel. I'm going to focus a little bit on the direction of travel from a citizen perspective, the UK policy context, and where next with that. I was interested in the opening poll and the initial division of responsibility placed on citizens, companies and governments in terms of creating a digital society. Fairly equally split, but by the end of the second discussion, more leaning towards government responsibility, which from my perspective I think is absolutely where we're at the moment. From a citizen perspective, I completely agree that we need a better informed and better empowered citizens body across the world to make the most of the positives of the internet and technology. But there clearly is a groundswell now of concerns around trust, consumer trust, trust in data, trust in forms of content online, and also in terms of user safety as well. So there's a lot of survey evidence in the UK, from Ofcom, from .everyone, from Which around this. So companies have to respond to that, and they have been, in part, responding to that, but it is reactive. And as Ellie Bradley said earlier, some of this is like a sticking plaster. Something happens, and then the companies need to take reactive steps to prevent the occurrence or the continuation of that particular issue. Only yesterday there was a story about TikTok and the prevalence now of terrorist content on the streaming service, which is used by children. They're dealing with it, which is great, but there is probably more of a proactive responsibility on many of these platforms to get there before that occurs. So that's where governments come in. So obviously governments are responsible for regulation. There's an acceptance, certainly in terms of social media companies, that the era of self-regulation is over. But the responsibility on government now is to make sure that regulation is good regulation, and that it's proportionate, and that it is risk assessed as well, so that the innovation and the dynamism of the internet and social media companies is preserved, but user safety is also paramount too. So internationally, obviously, we're seeing quite a lot of collaboration and cooperation on a lot of those areas. So there was the Christchurch call following the shootings in New Zealand. There's European moves towards faster takedown of terrorist content online. There's huge international cooperation on child sexual abuse imagery and other forms of child protection online as well, all of which are illegal, and that international cooperation is obviously vital for effective action to take place. But there is more of a move now internationally as well to addressing some of those more harmful but not illegal aspects of online activity. So in the new Audio Video Media Services Directive, there are responsibilities that are going to be put on video sharing platforms in relation to content to children. Across Parliament, now international parliaments, there's a Grand Committee on Disinformation, picking up on some of the points that Stacie made about the threats to elections and to democracy. And then the UN high-level panel on digital participation has obviously been looking too at some of the issues, particularly around the sort of human rights framework and how that translates into a digital age. Moving on to the UK, I mean, the UK has got a good story to tell, I think, on digital policy, on what it's done in the past, and on where it's starting from now on the online harms agenda. And it's not just on online harms. Obviously, there is work on digital competition through the Furman Review. There are reviews on digital advertising that's looking at the whole sort of ecosystem of the online world. But there's been a huge amount of parliamentary scrutiny and engagement, particularly on harms and particularly on the social media companies in this regard. And that has informed the landscape of policy development. The Online Harms White Paper, which was published earlier in the year by DCMS, recommends a statutory duty of care, but doesn't really explain what that is. And indeed, from a Carnegie UK Trust perspective, where we've done quite a lot of work on the development of a duty of care, is too focused on a notice and takedown regime, rather than looking at the systemic and holistic approaches that such a duty would require to be most effective. By systemic, that means responsibility being placed on companies at a design level when designing and rolling out services to ensure that they're tested, that they're risk assessed, that the potential consequences of those services have been assessed before that sort of that rollout or the production of new products. In doing so, then any kind of risks of harms can be identified, and in a regulatory framework, that means that the regulator then has something to look for should a harm occur sort of further down the line. So if you think about things like, if you look at it away from a content perspective, that means looking at the things that actually can cause the harms in a number of different areas. So for instance, how are algorithms working? Are they responsible for spreading disinformation? Are they responsible for spreading child sexual abuse imagery online? That's about the design choices that underpin the use of that particular piece of technology, rather than necessarily the consequential content. So what next? Well, obviously, in terms of UK political context, it's difficult to determine exactly where we're going next. The government has committed to pre-legislative scrutiny of a bill on online harms, but there's no timetable on that at all. And obviously there is a potential move towards greater sort of deregulation and a more sort of libertarian agenda as well, which could affect the policy direction of travel here. But to go back to the beginning and the kind of issues of trust and safety and responsibility, I think it is an opportunity and indeed a responsibility for the UK government to ensure that it continues with its stated aim to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, panelists, for those introductions to those topics. I have a feeling we have a lot of questions from the floor. While we're getting that set up, I will pose a first one and just say, what would the next step for you be, either on your topic that you discussed or on something that one of the other panelists brought up? What is something that we need to do now, since we are talking about the future of internet governance?
Okay, I think Sorry for that.
Discuss amongst yourselves.
I don't know if this answers your question, Stacie, but I think that the time has come, because the technology developments and policy reactions, shall we say, or not reactions always, but responses, are coming closer together, I think, and that's good. But I think it's also important to ensure that these discussions are inclusive. And I think I made this point before, but hurried reactions are not going to benefit anyone. And so what I hope is that we can take away the need to properly scrutinize and ask ourselves the questions of what values and what principles and what we're trying to protect and what we're trying to build when we're developing policy, and making sure that the discussions are as inclusive as possible. And I think the fact that the online harms bill will be open to pre-legislative scrutiny, the draft will be published, is an excellent example of that. It's not happening everywhere, and it should be.
So my answer is work more together instead of in silos. I know this is a broken record, but we heard from the Web Foundation this morning and the projects that they're doing, but also there are other projects that are very similar across the globe. And I think that if we kind of try to really work more together to be more efficient about that and share more learnings, positive and negative, but again, to be more efficient, that would actually help a lot, because I think we've spent a lot of time mapping projects and looking at projects and various things, whether it's capacity building or digital rollout, and I think we'd actually get a much more sort of inclusive digital environment in the UK, but more specifically globally, if we could actually do more work together.
And to continue the theme about inclusivity and participation and so forth, I mean, I agree with that. And I think one thing that is marked in the UK is that there is a sort of cross-party consensus on the need for good regulation in the kind of broad digital space, particularly in online harms as well. And I think it would be unfortunate, given the amount of parliamentary scrutiny, the amount of evidence and select committee work that's already been done in Parliament, if in a moment clearly of huge political uncertainty, that momentum and indeed that consensus was lost.
So starting with the questions that we've gathered from the room, there are many offline things that are illegal yet are still happening despite government intervention. How does the panel rate government's chances online? Who would like to start?
I think that's a fair point. And obviously that is about enforcement. It's about enforcement in the offline world and in the online world. I think there is, whether it's kind of criminal activity or not, I think what we have at the moment, particularly in the social media space, it may be different in other areas of technology, is a lack of scrutiny of the decisions that potentially lead to those platforms becoming the sites for illegal activity taking place. So while the enforcement is absolutely part of the kind of the criminal justice system responsibility, there is something about the context and the location of that being taking place where more responsibility could be taken by the company.
I think I would also add to that that a lot of the fighting illegal things offline takes cooperation and collaboration with other stakeholders. As it happens, you still need to do the same thing online, and so it's about really formalizing those processes and bringing those stakeholders in and involving them where necessary to help combat those online harms.
Yeah, I think that the point about cooperation is essential. Another thing I think we need to think about is that as I said, there's an increasing tendency to criminalize online acts in a way that's more severe, or simply to create new crimes online, and it's for crimes that things that don't actually exist offline, for things that are not criminalized offline. That's worrying because more of our lives are lived online. And certain things are not crimes and are being criminalized, like I mentioned, certain types of speech. And that's very worrying. So that's one thing that I think we need to ensure not only we're aware of, but that we're addressing what might be harmful or might be challenging in a way that doesn't necessarily resort directly to criminal sanction. There are alternative means to address some of the issues, and that needs to be considered, because what we could end up with is an online space which is less free than being offline, which would be, as far as I'm concerned, a disaster. So I think that's something we need to be really, really clear about, and alternative proposals and safeguards in legislation attempting to address these issues needs to be properly considered.
I think picking up on what Stacie said, I think the UK has an incredible multi-stakeholder approach to children online and child sexual exploitation images and content that is really seen as a gold standard across the globe. I've taught quite a lot on mobile children and mobile globally, not even in developed and developing countries, and the UK really has a lot to offer. And it's not just oh, this is great, it works really well. It's also there's been the discussion many years ago about over-blocking and how like stakeholders came together, and there was a lot of discussion going on and debate about that, and how the Open Rights Group had their position, and John Carr, responded. And I think what we're seeing is the UK has a really lot to offer by that process, because it is multi-stakeholder. It takes law enforcement, it takes government, it takes industry, and I think there's something to be said for that, and how that works successfully in terms of how it works as a multi-stakeholder entity.
Shifting gears just a little bit, we're going to go to DNS over HTTPS. So why is DOE bad from a user perspective? And with DOE, they are providing with choices for routing and online security. I think I'll start, and then happy for the panel to come in. So this is a very interesting conundrum that DOE puts us, especially the user, in. So it's claiming improved privacy. I'm not sure that I agree with those claims. It is encrypting data from one point to another point. It is giving choice to the user in some instances, not in every rollout. So for instance, in the US, Mozilla is planning a blanket rollout in their browser and giving an opt-out decision, not an opt-in decision, which I think is probably not the best way forward, particularly because informed consent is something that we have had, the internet governance, area has had issues with for years, for decades, about informed consent, about user data, about access to information, and that's at a very high level. That's at a kind of a service level, whereas this is now going actually into the inner workings of the internet. And I'm really wondering how much an average user will understand that change when they switch from their current DNS resolution model to another one. In switching, a user might not understand that they could lose some of the protections that are being provided to them by their current DNS provider. So for instance, in the UK, there's a close relationship between ISPs and enacting particular policies set out by government in terms of protecting children from images online, and sexually exploitative images. They also, ISPs have a huge role in terms of blocking and filtering malware and spam as well. And those types of services that are currently being provided to the end user may not be there anymore. And this is something that will be very complicated for an end user to understand. On the flip side, the user currently has choices. The user can set their DNS resolver. They can make that decision themselves. The user can use a browser like Tor that encrypts their activity online. They can use a VPN that changes where they're located in the world. So there are currently tools out there that end users can use to protect their movements, their actions, their data. And I'm currently trying to understand what the benefit is to moving a mass population over to DOE versus the current solutions that we have. I'm not saying that we can't do it. There are definitely some uses for something like this. But I think it's something that we really, as a society, should make sure that we have the right safeguards set up so that we don't lose some of the protections and rights that we currently have.
Can I just follow?
Yeah.
Can I follow on with that? So I think it's been a really interesting discussion at the IETF that I've been to for the last year. In talking to network management people, so ISPs and operators, one of the biggest issues is going to be the continued lack of control for their network management, which includes malware and it's everything that you've seen perhaps discussing it. But that means that they're going to have to change how the networks work again, and it's going to cost more, which ultimately ends up being that cost goes to the user, right? And that has to do with where the DNS servers are deployed, and it goes on and on from a technical perspective. And I agree with Stacie. I don't think a lot of users actually even know what it is. I think there was a survey recently, it was like 80% didn't even know what DNS was or something, and I think that was from the US. We can't also look over or ignore the fact that network operators have legal requirements in the countries in which they operate, and this is going to make it difficult to basically have that achieve, whether it's filtering content, all the things that we don't like, but do remember that at least we can have those discussions in these countries, unlike some other countries, right? Unlike countries where this is going on, that there is no civil discourse about this, and that's what I always say. I think finally one of the biggest issues and one of the things that confuses me the most is this gives more data to Google and Cloudflare, and even though they get criticized for having user data in other areas, I'm really surprised that hasn't been an issue yet in this area. And it's really interesting, and it's, this is not something that I'm particularly entering a debate on, but I think it's a really interesting lack of discussion or lack of debate on that area.
Any other thoughts from the panel before we move on?
No, I think, yes, I guess. No, yes. I think that what you've just been saying proves the point we've been making about the need to bring together the different communities. So those creating standards as civil society organizations, policymakers, and making sure that what is developed, standards that are developed, whether they're technical or otherwise, reflect the concerns of the broad range of constituencies that are affected by them. This has clearly not happened with DOE. It hasn't happened in the first committee either, where there's been suggestions and frameworks developed, and the constituencies affected have absolutely no idea that they're even mentioned in these reports, and are being told to implement the recommendations. So, I think we're seeing this across the board, and that hopefully is changing, but it certainly needs to.
That's a great point. Thank you. Okay, and we still have some time. So I think this is a good follow-on to what we were just talking about. And it says, the big policy question seems to be privacy versus security, with big tech pushing for more encryption and governments wanting more security. Who wins? Now, I think this is a particularly interesting question because you can actually unpick the question in many different ways. Is there anyone that would like to start? Shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think first off, I'm just going to say I'm not sure that big tech is pushing more encryption and governments are pushing more security, or what that even necessarily means. I think encryption is a good thing, and for cybersecurity, you definitely need encryption in those systems where appropriate. And so I think government would be behind that. So I think it's about understanding the limits of technology, encryption being one of those technologies, and understanding who it's benefiting and for what purpose. I think that actually, God, I lost my train of thought. Not enough coffee this morning. So I think that this privacy versus security conundrum, I don't think it can be a versus. I think they're two sides of the same coin, and you really need one for the other to be present in these systems.
Just to follow on from that, I mean, I agree with that, and in terms of the question, who wins, I'd say, well, surely citizens should win, shouldn't they? I mean, if this tension, battle, debate is held properly and openly and honestly, and the consequences and ramifications of decisions, whether they're tech decisions or business decisions or service decisions, are openly and transparently made and risk assessed and designed properly, then surely it's not about, it's not the versus between sort of government and tech, but actually it should be for the benefit of everybody.
I'm just aware that we're going to work. We have 10 more minutes, right?
We have 10 more minutes, yeah.
And it would be interesting to hear from you as well, from the audience. But I completely agree with what you've said so far. I don't think it's about big tech versus governments necessarily, although that's often how it's portrayed. It's not about privacy versus security. That's a fight no one wins. No one gets anything out of. Nobody wants that. But I think what it is a lot of quite complex issues being simplified, and that's, again, a situation no one wins from. So we often hear, instead of privacy versus security, we need to be talking about security versus more security versus less security. And that's what the proposals are often about. When we hear proposals which would attempt to force, for example, manufacturers to build in weaknesses into technology, that's less security, that's not more security. So that's not something that is in anyone's interest. Ensuring that crimes can be investigated, yes, is in our interest. So that discussion needs to be more nuanced. That's a discussion maybe about law enforcement capacity to sift through an insane amount of data, because we have more data than we've ever had before. That's about building those capacities and trainings, how to request data from cloud servers, etc. And there's been some research in the US context that has shown that even just more resources for law enforcement and how to do that can help to ease the burden or to help to solve crimes more easily. It's a question about, are we talking about data at rest on devices? Are we talking about encryption more generally? And this is a nuanced discussion and needs to be nuanced. And for that reason, it needs to involve more stakeholders. And that's why it's of concern when it happens in multilateral spaces, in closed spaces, and the discussions are simplified as privacy versus security or law enforcement versus civil liberties. That's not the discussion. And hopefully, as more people are involved, we will start to have a more nuanced discussion about the issues.
I have two more questions I'm going to try and get to, unless there's anything from the floor. Okay, so, there's one. We'll just see one on the floor first.
Well, I was getting confused whether to type on Slido or not, but the panelists made me more easier. So one of the consideration was on DNS over app. Let's consider in terms of North perspective, and I will relate it with the Asian perspective. So there is still the transition from IPv4 to v6, in which there's in major part of South Asia could not implement it because of the users issues and the different types of governance issue. So in consideration with the DNS over app, can we see in the flip side where the dark web is being operated on with that platform? Wouldn't it be helpful for the terrorists or those dark web supporters? My question is that. And let's think out of the box, and my question goes more specific to Dominic and Maeve. We talk about the standards and policy kind of things, like when we talk about the data migration kind of thing, especially for the financial data transactions outside of the UK or into the UK, considering the Brexit kind of thing. So this will be my specific questions. Thank you.
Do you want me to talk about data? Sure. So this is not my area of expertise, but obviously there's a European framework that you're rightly concerned about, and I'm not going to talk about Brexit either. But also cross-border data. There's quite a lot of, it's not just about standards, but it's also about agreements, multilateral and bilateral agreements, World Trade agreements, WTO agreements, as well as agreements between banking sectors and also just different regions as well. So there's a lot more going on that I think will be able to be used going forward. Unfortunately, it's going to be more difficult. I think it'll be quite frustrating, but obviously keeping in mind that there's an element of privacy and security that needs to go with that as well. So I'll just stop there and answer that one.
And just following on from that, obviously not talking about Brexit specifically, but in the sense of kind of forthcoming trade deals and so forth, obviously there are clearly going to be trade-offs in a lot of these areas too, which I think people need to be very mindful of and ideally ahead of as well. So.
Okay, then I think we'll go into one on emerging harms. Does the reference to tackling emerging harms in the online harms white paper not force companies into self-regulation when it comes to this category? It's an interesting question.
So From our perspective, obviously from the work that we've done at Carnegie UK Trust, we have a sort of slightly different view on how a statutory duty of care and the approach to harms in that sense would work. Tackling emerging harms, I think, is very much about ensuring, and the approach to harms in that sense would work. Tackling emerging harms, I think, is very much is not reactive, that it's forward-looking. So if you have a principle-based are going to be kind of fit for purpose. But I think there is also then a kind of a longer held tradition in sort of policy making around a precautionary principle, which again says that if you're not entirely sure about the potential risks of a particular service or a particular development or an innovation, and indeed the evidence hasn't built up to be categorically sure about the impact of it, then you should actually proceed with caution. So again, you can build that into a regulatory framework that doesn't constrain innovation and doesn't constrain companies from either regulating themselves or shutting down user sort of interaction with that service, but ensures that the greater number of users are protected.
Okay, we'll try and take one last question before we go. So, what role is there for governments and civil society to educate people on how to critically engage with social media disinformation?
So that's all me. I think that civil society and actually all stakeholders have a role to play in that, and it's an important role to play because when we're talking about responsibilities and roles of different stakeholders, there's sometimes a lack of clarity about, well, government will legislate and then civil society will do the capacity building. I think there's a role for everyone in that. But on ensuring that people are able to use the internet in a way that maximizes their life opportunities is essential. We also have to make sure that the conditions are in place in terms of regulation for that to be the case, and regulation is not constraining, constraining people. So I would say that the responsibility kind of falls on everyone, and certainly we need to operate within regulatory frameworks and develop regulatory frameworks that are not constraining. And just picking up on that point about emerging harms, I don't know what an emerging harm is, but I think we ought to remember that 100 years ago, someone encouraging women to vote or proclaiming that women should vote would have been seen as radical and potentially something dangerous. And I know it seems absurd, but that's where the question comes to. Well, we can't really necessarily predict what will happen, but we need to make sure that the principles of transparency and accountability, if those are going to fall on private sector actors, which they increasingly will and should, are there. And that our regulation reflects that. So I think the principles remain the same around transparency and accountability, and we build everything around that, and we ensure that we adapt to whatever comes with that in mind. So I'm trying to tackle two questions in one go there. I don't know if that worked, but yes.
I think I'll add just very quickly on this last point of disinformation. Countries like Canada and the Netherlands have started public awareness campaigns, starting with school-age children all the way up through adults, to teach them about how they find information online, how to check information online, how to trust who you're getting your information from. I think that's really important. I think it's also important for civil society and watchdogs to let government and platforms know what data they need, what needs to be published, what needs to be publicly available, so that we can have greater oversight of these platforms and how they're affecting our societies. I also think that, and this is in a report that was just published last week by the Oxford Technology and Elections Commission, I also think that we need to have a database of political campaigners' social media accounts so that we as users have somewhere that we can go so that we know we can find the actual account for a campaigner and we can follow that account instead of a fake account or another account that might be spreading some misinformation. So those are just a couple of last thoughts from me on that topic. And with that, we are going to bring our panel to a close. So thank you very much, Maeve, Sheetal, and Dominique for joining me up here. And